Hello and welcome to this May edition of the Open Security Summit. We are joined by Sarb today to give us this session on the next insider threat isn't your staff. Any questions you want to ask, please put them in the chat or raise your hand. Over to you, Sarb. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining me. This is a session that's been sort of in the works for quite some time now. It's as a result of a whole range of activities and work that I've done in the past and I'm currently doing. So there are some things that we're working on currently that I'll mention later on that may be of interest, and you can follow up. And if you've got any questions, if you could leave them towards the end, that's probably easier. I have left some time and we'll take it from there. Okay, the session description, I've just rewritten it here. This is for reference because there were some typos in the original text that I sent over. I didn't get a chance to correct them, but they are covered in this slide deck here. Okay, so the agenda, basically I'm going to be looking at things like people, process, technology, and the environments when the research around insider threat was first undertaken. I have done some sessions in the past on insider threat, and you will probably not be mistaken in the way that I skimmed through everything very, very quickly, and that is intentional. It's not that I don't know enough about it, it's that I want to focus on other things. And I apologize now. Basically, if I say something that you know is wrong, do feel free to pull me up on it and I can clarify. I don't have any issues with that, but I am trying to move on and not stick too long covering the insider threat in detail. Also, going to be trying to look at what's changed and the fact that everything has changed, and at the same time, nothing's changed. Some of the standards, frameworks, regulations, the business context of what's going on at the moment and has been for the last few years, dual connectivity, the growth in connection options, the growth in wireless IoT and the widening threat surface, and to finish off with the new insider threat and examples in the wild. Okay, and my background very quickly, I have been sort of management consultant in one of my past lives and done a lot of work around organizational culture, which was useful in security in looking at user awareness and how to change culture. And I was also in development before I got in security for about 10 years, and I've been in security for over 20 years. And I researched about 17 years ago now some of the vulnerabilities in network CCTV systems. And it was through accident that I then sort of worked in the field of IoT and looking at convergence and the convergence of technologies and the convergence of risk and looking at risk from a single point of view. And through some of the work I was involved in on that, I've been lucky enough to be sort of joining the IoT Security Foundation's Executive Steering Board, and I'm also co-chair of the Smart Built Environment Group of the IoT Security Foundation, and I've been the co-chair for the last 4 or 5 years. I have written several papers on smart city security over the last few years as well. One of my current roles is the Chief Information Security Officer for AirEye, and I have had an interest in connected and autonomous devices for quite some time, and that's really what I'm trying to bring into this session to an extent. So with that said, if you've got any questions, do save them till the end, as I said. Let's start with looking at people first of all. Now, we will sort of generally, I guess, when we talk about security, we often talk about people in a very generic way, and I'm going to stick to that because some of the research that was done on the insider threat was some of the early research was in the late 90s by Rand, and it carried on for about 10, 11 years. And most of what we hear today was as a result of much of the pioneering work in many respects that was done in the late 90s and early 2000s. And, you know, apart from Rand, the Department of Defense in the US, DARPA, MITRE. There were several organizations that did some sort of groundbreaking research at the time. And much of it at that time also really looked at and started with physical intrusion detection, and then started to look at what someone could do as an insider within the organization. Several of them looked at motivation, what sort of behavior traits that insiders had or have. And some of the talks that I've done in the past have looked at the psychology and really tried to plot users as they go along from being an insider who's not an insider threat to changes within the work environment that may lead them to become an insider threat. And there's been a lot of research that has been done. It's all great, but much of it is still sort of 10, 15 years old in many respects. And over that period of time, in the early days, in terms of people, I know, being in IT myself when I was in development, the power of sysadmins, data admins grew, and it carried on growing through the internet revolution and so on. And we saw in the early 2000s things like Yahoo flotation, where users were the dominant part of what was going on. And yes, I know in IT we call users as users, and we're one of the few groups out there that call our staff users or our users users, the other one being the drug industry. And I know that many CISOs, and myself included, have often said that that's wrong. We shouldn't be calling them users. They are staff, they are human beings, they are people. But the point I was trying to make was, back in the days of Yahoo flotation, organizations started to see users as the dominant thing that valued and enabled valuations of companies. And again, in the early 2000s, during the time of a lot of this research, there wasn't much user awareness going on in enterprises. And those that were around were very basic user awareness programs. And most of the organizations trusted, in those days, everyone that came into the organizations. And so many of the original tricks that the physical pen testers used to talk about and use, and intrusion detection, that were identified during that time, everything from, joining smokers outside a building and then walking in behind them, things like that. Many of these things still exist today, but it was from those days. And there were lots and lots of research that was done. And one of the research papers by MITRE in 2009 raised the issue and said, the more and more research we do raises more and more questions. So many of those papers looked at those questions, and there hasn't been as much groundbreaking research done on insider threats. So that's people very generally. This image here, this is how in those days, the offices were set where you were in cubicles and everything was. Now the open plan offices are very different to the ones that there were in those days. And processes, in terms of processes, most of the processes were ignored in those early days, and they were a pain to use by many people. And the processes that did exist, I mean, this quote here, security is a process, not a product. It is, and I've linked to where it came from, Bruce Schneier's blog from the year 2000 in April. And you can still get it. It's a really good blog. It still exists today, and this is in the archives. And if we look at some of those processes that we had from the standards, from the early days of BS 7799, as it was called, and then ISO 17799, before we had the 27000 series. And in those days, there was COBIT, there was NIST. And in those early days of processes, what they missed in some respects that we've caught up on more so now, in a big way, was what we do now in terms of assurance and governance in security. And really, the processes that we had compared to what we've got today were quite limited in number. We have got 1,001 different standards come from processes that we can use, their frameworks. There's lots and lots of controls that we can actually identify that exists today that didn't exist in those early days. And moving very quickly and swiftly to technology, this is just a collection of some of the technology changes that we've seen. Mobile phones, connections in terms of evolution on connecting to the internet, the computers from being big bulky things to very light things, the internet of things connections, that image there will exceed 50 billion by year 2020. It did, and we're going well beyond that. The internet speeds have changed so much from in the days when the research on insider threat was undertaken. So much has changed in technology terms, and there's so many more technology controls that exist that didn't exist in those days. I remember going to my first InfoSec. I think it's about the year 2002, 3, around there somewhere. It may even have been 4 if I'm wrong. And it was a room full of about 80 vendors, and virtually all of them were either firewall vendors or anti-malware or antivirus, as we used to call it then. And every single control that was available in those early days was around those 2 sets of technologies. There wasn't much else in those days. However, things have changed since then. And thing is, in terms of what has changed, you know, so much has changed when we look at technology, for example. This is there are many of these infographic type things around with lots of different technologies, and you can break it down in lots and lots of different ways. The shortage of technology has no bounds. Every week, we hear of new technologies that covers things from very different angles, that looks at threats from a very different angle as well. And really, I mean, I often use that phrase that what's changed is everything and nothing. And it is true. And what I'm hoping to do in the next sort of 20 minutes is very quickly go through some of those things. And we have changed a lot. If we look at on the people side, you know, we have got better user awareness. We have got training courses for staff other than the standards, so the certification training courses. We have got proper training courses around developing skills. Teams have got bigger around security. We've got more specialisms than we had in those days. And everything's expanded. In terms of the people side of things, we have got a lot better than we ever had in those days. The processes and technologies that we see in terms of standards and what controls that we can use and what processes are there as controls. This is just one of many images that are out there that will give you an idea of some of the standards. And there are organizational standards, there are technology standards, there are technical standards, there are specifications, there are 1,001 different things that we can look at that have changed, that are very different. And they are more mature than they ever used to be. But it's very interesting that despite the maturity on so many things, the last standard to come out in terms of wireless networking technologies, or the one that specialized in that from the ISO, was in 2014. And that particular standard that came out in 2014 was initiated and it was talked about, it was developed early 2012, but by the time it came out was 2014. And what it included and the controls that it included, and it's very telling right now, are controls that dealt with the threats of 2012. They're not, it's not the standard that you can use today for the threats that are available today. And other examples that we can look at are, for example, if you look at the NIST cybersecurity framework, if you break it down into assets and also the functions around identify, protect, detect, respond and recover, majority of those controls, if you map them to the assets around network, users, devices, applications, data and so on, majority of those are around protection, because that's the way a lot of security was based. It was around protecting, and more so since 2012, we've accepted in security that yes, we try and protect, but the chances are we are going to get breached. We need to invest more on detection technologies and responding technologies as well. And there has been that balance in terms of budgets as well. We've seen a lot of those changes. So those standards that were written at that time, they're all focused on the prevention side, and you can analyze them and identify that they all focus on networks. And essentially, it's the wired networks that they focus on. And the detection side of things, I haven't included some slides in here, but we've done some analysis just recently looking at those standards and what they focus on. And many of these on the detection side, almost every control in the cybersecurity framework covers under detection. The controls that are there are all retrospective because they all rely on logs. There isn't any indication of using real-time feeds that you can identify and detect things immediately. It's all around logs, collecting logs, putting them into the cloud, analyzing them, using other tools and not using different technologies. So again, the standards that we've got, they are beginning to age. HIPAA is another example. As a standard, if you look at HIPAA and you analyze it into, again, identify, protect, detect, respond and recover, and you look at the assets in terms of networking, data and so on, most of the controls are around encryption because the standard is focused on data. It's focused on data and it's focused on encrypting data so nothing goes wrong with it. However, unfortunately, if you do get attacked and somebody's got access as a user, as a legitimate user, none of those controls, even if data is encrypted, the fact that they're logged in as a user, they'll have access to all that data. So many of these standards now, yes, as good as they were, are beginning to age. And some of the changes that we've seen in the business environment and the business context, we have got a lot more specialism in terms of organizations, in terms of what we buy, in terms of how we buy the different range of things. This was a sort of stark thing in my mind a couple of years ago when I first heard that some of the banks like the Metro Bank, when it set up, it chose to outsource all of its IT because it didn't consider IT as its core competency. It considered banking as its core competency. And there are many organizations out there that will outsource many things to those third parties who have a better handle on that competency, where the main organization will focus on whatever its main competencies are. Also, in terms of the business environment, we've had agile moving in to the organizations in lots and lots of different ways, especially over the last 2 years, where we've seen, with cloud computing, with COVID, where we've had to scale up or scale down and according to demand and make those changes that we need to make much quicker. And in terms of those changes, we've actually had really true network sort of working from anywhere, rather than it being one of those things that was talked about, but what didn't actually exist. But COVID has actually moved it on, where not only do we get true networking from anywhere, and it's not just a case of it being accepted, but it's now become business imperative for many organizations to track staff from all over the world as opposed to from a single location. And shopping really has moved home. Home shopping is really home shopping, unlike the way it used to be. And businesses have understood that and tried to enable that in many ways. And remote monitoring has increased. And what I mean by remote monitoring is remote monitoring of your physical environment. And this was exampled in the first 6 months of COVID in lockdown. There was the sale of remote monitoring tools like CCTV and remote burglar alarm, fire alarm, and all of those things went up, especially within smaller organizations that previously hadn't seen the need to use those sorts of technologies. And these changes really just reinforce the need that businesses have had to cut the cord and go to wireless networking. And in terms of wireless networking, we have seen the growth, and these are just some of the sort of stats that are out there. The global value of Wi-Fi to grow from 2021, 3.3 trillion, in 2025 to 4.9 trillion. That is a massive growth. And really unleashing the connectivity, there's a more and more connectivity. Top 10 wireless trends, they've been growing in lots and lots of different ways. And the growth of wireless has been absolutely phenomenal. And it's been sort of expanded by IoT. And this is IoT in personal use, in home use, in medical, in non-medical, in fleet, in vehicles, in almost every sort of sector you look at. It's been impacted by the use of IoT and wireless IoT. It has been growing very, very fast. And really, that's great. And it's been fantastic to see that in many organizations, the number of wired devices compared to the number of wireless devices is such that the wired devices probably count for about 20% of network devices. The wireless accounts for about 80% of the network devices. And that has been growing, and it's not going to get smaller. And that's fantastic. However, as fantastic as that is, it's also got some problems with it. And some of these problems really are, based on some of the sort of, I guess, the behavior that we've observed, some of the work that we've been doing, is that we see lots and lots of devices that have got a range of vulnerabilities, first of all. And in terms of IoT devices, you've got characteristics, as the slide shows you, and potential security weaknesses and targets. This isn't about this, so I'm not going to go into this in great detail, particularly, but the idea is that there are many, many weaknesses and vulnerabilities within these. Also, on top of that, the fact is that with all these devices, we have seen the problem, which is dual-homed connectivity and peer-to-peer connectivity. In the old days, and why I've used the image on the left is because I did do some research on looking at dual-homed connectivity, and some of the forums out there on networking where people have asked the question, what's wrong with dual-homed connectivity? And quite clearly, a lot of the network security people have said, well, the problem is you can't have a dual-homed host where you've got a computer with one network card that's connecting to the DMZ or the outside network, and another network card which connects to the internal network, because basically, if you haven't got a firewall between them, it enables someone to come in and there's a bridge between them to get into the corporate network. And that has been the problem. And as you can see in this image on the left-hand side, there is the firewall there in that image. However, unfortunately, that isn't always the case with some of the devices connected today. The other issue is that the peer-to-peer connectivity. On the right there, that's from Krebs on security. It's basically a P2P vulnerability a good few years ago, and it affected lots and lots of devices. Now, in terms of some of the peer-to-peer connectivity, there are many, many options around wireless, and whether it's just peer-to-peer that you might be able to do on a single mobile device onto another single mobile device, or other options. We have seen so many different options coming up in devices more and more year after year. And the options have grown, which is great. And this sort of covers some of those types of options in terms of Bluetooth, Zigbee, Wi-Fi, RFID, near-field communication, all of these different things. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you very quickly a real life sort of setting in a hospital, and the types of connectivity that we've seen in an environment there, where basically ways to connect, if you take the medical device itself, and then you get a medical station or tool, and then you've got corporate network and local access point. Now, if you've got those, we found within one environment, a single hospital, 5 ways that there was connectivity. And this isn't unusual. We found lots of different environments where there's just as many different ways, but they don't have to be like this. So the first way is where we've seen the medical device connect to the corporate network, or the device connects through another bridge of some sort to the corporate network. That's the second one. The third one is where you've got a medical station. This is a portable plate. This is an X-ray plate where this goes underneath whatever you're trying to X-ray, and then you've got the medical device itself. So they're connecting to each other, and then that medical station tool connects to the corporate network through that device, and it connects to all the patient records and so on through that device and through that connection. Then you've also got, in the fourth type of connection, where you've got one medical device that connects to another medical device, which may be a sister device, to the corporate network, and then where you've got a medical station tool which will connect through a PC and then onto the corporate network as well. Now, this is just one example of the type of networks we found within a single environment. Now, in terms of that, the device connection behavior that we observed in that single site, some of the interesting things we found were the fact that some of those devices connected to the default vendor network that the vendor had set, even though that vendor network was not in the airspace that where the device was actually installed. So you found them trying to connect to a network that didn't exist. And as anyone knows, if you spoof the SSID it's searching for, which the vendor's SSID, you could connect straight to that device, and connecting straight to that device, once you've connected to that device, because the device itself has dual connectivity, it will then connect to the corporate network as well. And then another thing that we found was where devices were connecting to the strongest signal first, whatever that strongest signal was, before offering you the option to connect to other networks. So if you rebooted a device, it would still go for that strongest signal first, rather than whatever you thought you'd set and you'd set as a permanent one. Some of these devices don't support WPA2, which again, as we all know, is insecure. WPA2 is secure, but anything less than that is not secure. Also, we found devices that had wired and wireless interfaces, but when you rebooted them, they would attempt to connect to the vendor network wirelessly, even though it didn't exist, despite the fact that you were already connected on a wired network as you rebooted it. And we found this on devices where it was still trying to connect intermittently, even after reboot, 2 years after initial installation by the vendor. Also, we found devices like, for example, training dummies, you know, like the respiratory dummies where you do your mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Dummies like that, where basically you connect them to your corporate laptop to run the simulation, which then tells you whether the person trying to resuscitate did a good job or not. And basically, these devices connected to the corporate laptop, and then they updated simulation and fed the data straight through your laptop to the vendor's laptop as well. Network. And so there's lots of device behavior which we've seen in different environments, and I've stuck to keeping to the medical one for the moment here. but we have seen in different environments lots and lots of other different changeable things, which we thought were weird and strange and shouldn't be allowed and are anti-security. Sorry, let me just, right. Some of the real life examples that we've seen, we've been doing research around these, and some of the things that I've covered, we've observed and we've seen they're vulnerable, but we've done some work with some of the pen testers out there. The first report that we're making available was done by Peter Basil from Hedgehog Security, and in that report, which was a real life breach over the air, where he talks about the fact that they had a client subjected to over the targeted attack targeted at several devices within the IT environment. The attack was a success, and the attackers obtained system level access to 3 devices within the network, remain undetected. To facilitate the detectable data egress, the attackers connected each of the 3 devices to separate O2 Wi-Fi hotspot accounts, providing egress points that would bypass any IPS, content filtering, or firewall. Of more significant concern was that this was also bypassed all the security monitoring, rendering the business blind to the attackers' actions. The only way that alerted them was the fact that there was this shared space, and the disk space was being used because they were saving all the data. I think it's about 240 gigabytes of data, and the disk space warning came up, and that's what alerted them. And they thought that the first time round, they ignored it. And then they got the second warning, and they thought, oh, we better look at this. And that's why they looked at this. We are doing lots of other research, and we have come across a bunch of other devices and a bunch of other scenarios which are real life attacks that we've seen out there in the wild. So let me just check where I'm up to in terms of, right, I've got plenty of time, that's fine. So in terms of the widening threat landscape, what we have seen is that it's not just where connections are made, it's to do with devices and what devices connect to, how they connect, the default connection settings, whether the settings can and cannot be changed. And most of the technology standards and the extended implementations beyond the standards are difficult, because what we have found, if we look at Wi-Fi Direct as an example, and this slide here with the Hedgehog research, that was through a TV. It was a TV network which was compromised. We have seen Wi-Fi Direct being compromised as well. Wi-Fi Direct is a technology standard which, although the standard itself is secure, and I don't want to give the impression that it's not secure, although the standard is secure, originally in its original format, the scope was quite limited. And because it was quite limited, most of the vendors that have used it have added extra functionality themselves. And where they've added the functionality, that's usually where we've seen issues. And I'm going to mention 2 vendors, but they are dominant in their field, which is why it's easy to mention those. One is in terms of printers. We have seen printers where Wi-Fi Direct has been an issue for a whole range of printers and different models over the last few years. And one of the biggest suppliers that has been affected, only because they're dominant in that field, has been Hewlett-Packard. TV-wise, again, because they're dominant, we've seen Samsung being affected when it comes to Wi-Fi Direct. The fact is, when you've got dual connected devices, there is no firewall between one network interface and the other one, and it means that all these devices are effectively providing a bridge between the 2 connections. Wi-Fi Direct can be switched on and off by almost anyone, so other than and including the network or printer administrator or IT, whoever it might be. We've seen in many environments where, anyone can come along and switch it off and it's fine, but 2 minutes later, somebody else come and switch it on and it's switched back on again. And not only that, we've seen environments where basically you've got a device like a printer where you've got the device connected by wired, so they are corporate enterprise printers as opposed to personal printers, so they're wired and they've got Wi-Fi turned on, and on top of that they've got Wi-Fi direct switched on as well. And they end up being in a situation where they've got all of those connectivities on, and if anyone was to break into any of those, Wi-Fi direct or Wi-Fi, they have got the bridge into whatever network it might be that they're connected to. Also, we know that users are busy. They have been busy. I was involved in a webinar last week talking about the insider threat, and the fact is, in today's business environment, users are busy. They're expected to do more in less time. What they want to do is they want to be able to, forget about switching on this, switching on that, trying to be cautious about this, trying to have to look at phishing emails. They want to make sure that technology works in the way that it needs to work without it being vulnerable, and for it to provide what they expect it to provide, not with lots and lots of vulnerabilities that they don't know about, or that they need to be cautious about, or that they need to learn about. They've got enough to do without having to worry about all these vulnerabilities and things like that. And essentially, the biggest changes we've seen have been around technologies and technology integration. Users themselves, in many respects, are trying to do what they've always tried to do, which is achieve what they want, what they need to achieve for in a lot less time for their employers, and trying to get all that work done and be agile and work from home, work from the office, wherever they needed to work from, move around in any way that they need to move around from. And some of the other changes that we know that we have seen is the fact that there is a lot of research that's going on around wireless networking, around Wi-Fi direct, around IoT. There's not a single black hat in the last 5 to 10 years that there hasn't been a focus on IoT and networking. And if you look at vulnerabilities and some of the research over the last, let's say, 4 or 5 years, there's been more vulnerabilities around Wi-Fi than there has been before that. And that's really because there's a lot more research going on now, having identified some of the things that have been going on. So really it's growing, not getting smaller. Some of these things, I think we're finding that they are yet to be uncovered in many respects. So in terms of what's changed, what's not changed, I think it's important for us to consider in terms of research. People still want to do what's easiest for them and quickest. As in terms of insiders, the workers inside our organizations, they've always wanted to try to do what they need to do in less time. They want the technology to just work the way it should do, the way that they expect it to do, and the way that they've been led to believe it works, and not be vulnerable outside the box, and have faster, more easier connections from all devices, regardless of whether they've patched or unpatched or not. And I know that's not acceptable from us, because we know they need to be patched, but that's not what our staff want. It's not what they expect. And in terms of where we see things changing, effectively, the growth in devices and the growth in multiple simultaneous connections is going to grow, not get smaller. If you look at Android devices, they now, the latest versions of Android do come with other ways to connect to other Android devices, which is more or less their own version of Wi-Fi direct on Android devices. So the point I'm making there is we should get used to the fact that we're going to get multiple simultaneous dual connections or multi-connections. And really, we need to be looking at building in the security. But in the meantime, if we can't build it in, it's not built in, we need to be looking at that, because these devices in the dual connectivity is what's going to cause some of the biggest problems that we like to encounter. So the growth in dual connected or multi-connected devices without any security to block them is where a lot of those changes are going to be. And in terms of what I've tried to make sure I was covering is what's changed is nothing and everything. And I hope, I've impressed on people that, there's a lot of things that have changed, but at the same time, we still get users who, after 20 plus years of user awareness training, still get their passwords wrong and not to what they've been told. That will always happen, I believe. We in security need to find alternatives. There are many other things that we cannot change, and our staff and their attitudes towards security. Yes, we know that staff are our biggest asset, but we don't always treat them as that biggest asset. What we need to start looking at doing is, looking less at blaming them, looking less at our user awareness programs, trying to focus on what they're doing wrong and focus on what they're doing right, and start looking at not them as the insider threat, but looking at staff. Yes, I'm not trying to deny the fact that there will always be some sort of insider threat in terms of human beings and people, but that threat in proportion to some of the technology changes that we've had over the last 5 to 10 years, the way that they're going in the next 5 to 10 years are moving more to identities as devices, because if I've got a network, a laptop, and that laptop, when I was working at home, connected wirelessly to my home network, I go into the office, put it into a docking station. Now it's still searching because I've got to switch my Wi-Fi off. It's still searching for a home network. And because it's still searching for that, if an attacker comes along and finds that and spoofs that network and connects, all of those sorts of issues, users shouldn't necessarily have to worry about them. But the fact is that they still do. And the fact is that we're in an environment where devices are probably the issue. It's not our staff as users of those devices. And we need to start looking at what the issues are around some of the technologies that we're using. And those technologies have greater autonomy, and they are beginning to be more and more autonomous than they ever were. And we've got more devices on our corporate networks that are autonomous in many respects than the number of users that we've got. And we need to move and start looking at things and our network connections and our network devices in ways that will enable us to understand that our users are our users, and what they do compared to what our devices do are connected, and what that relationship is, and start looking at behaviors of devices as well as users and connections in the way that we observe our networks and look for threats. I think that's me done, and I'm open for questions. The new insider threat is the multi-connected devices. So I will stop there and I open up for questions. Dennis,
feel free to. Oh, so if you feel free to put your
Hey Sam, good stuff, man. Really great presentation. It is very interesting, right? How these things evolve and how we need to now take all of these into consideration, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, really good. Is any questions on the chat? No, I think we're good.
If anyone is interested in any research, particularly about the TV research that I mentioned, drop me a line, and we are looking at Wi-Fi Direct, a breach that happened in the wild, and we're producing a report on that as well. We have seen in our own technology reports that we've picked out in the wild, but we don't normally report on those. So what we're doing is working with some pen testers that and some responders and we're using their reports and their research and make sure it's independent. So we have got in the next few months lots of these sorts of scenarios that we've seen from real life attacks coming up. And if there's anyone interested, or if you've seen one, if you're a pen tester and you've seen them, it'd be great to do some work with you to see how we can promote that work.
Cool. All right. I think we'll end it there.